Imagine the person you trust the most suddenly turning into someone you fear. How do you even begin to protect yourself from someone who was supposed to guide you? This is the story of Sophia Mitchell, a bright, 18-year-old high school senior from the small town of Riverton, Ohio, who unknowingly became the object of a teacher's dangerous obsession. It all started in the fall of 2021, a time when everything seemed ordinary in her life. Little did she know, her world was about to shatter in the most terrifying way. Sophia was the picture of small-town perfection. With her curly hair, intelligent eyes, and dreams of becoming a writer, she was adored by her classmates and respected by her teachers. But behind that bright smile, Sophia often felt the sting of loneliness. Raised by a hardworking father, Michael Mitchell, and a mother, Rebecca Mitchell, who was still recovering from a rocky marriage, Sophia often found herself turning to books for comfort. She spent hours writing short stories in her journal, dreaming of a life where she could escape her family's complicated past. It was during this time, as the crisp autumn air settled in Riverton, that David Turner, a 32-year-old substitute teacher with a mysterious past, arrived at the school. He was quiet, unassuming, and seemed harmless enough at first, gaining the trust of both faculty and students. David had moved to Riverton in search of a fresh start, leaving behind an unsettling history that no one knew about. He was immediately intrigued by Sophia. In class, as he taught literature, their conversations about poetry and symbolism grew longer and more frequent. There was a connection there, a bond over shared intellectual passions that both found comforting. Sophia, in her naivety, saw it as just another classroom discussion, one of many that fueled her love for literature. But for David, it was something more. The way she spoke, the way her eyes lit up when she discussed her favorite books, something about it captivated him. It felt like they were kindred spirits. In his mind, their connection was something deep and undeniable, and it was something he couldn't ignore. As the weeks went by, David's admiration for Sophia turned into an obsession. He started arriving early to school, lingering around the hallways, hoping to catch a glimpse of her. He followed her to the library, pretending to be interested in books he had no intention of reading, just to be near her. The more he saw of Sophia, the more he believed that their connection was meant to be. Sophia, however, was starting to feel uneasy. It wasn't just his attentiveness, it was the way he looked at her. At first, she thought it was all in her head. But soon, the way he watched her from the back of the room during class, the way his voice softened when he spoke to her, made her realize something was off. She started to avoid him, taking different routes to class, staying after school less, and trying to keep her interactions with him brief. Yet David was relentless. He was everywhere. He would find reasons to talk to her after class, always asking about her latest essay or the books she was reading. But the conversations were no longer innocent. They had an edge to them, a tension that Sophia couldn't shake. She didn't understand what was happening, but something inside her told her to be careful. One evening, after a long day at school, as Sophia walked home through the quiet streets of Riverton, she noticed a car parked on her street. It was David's car. At first, she tried to brush it off, thinking it was a coincidence. But when she reached her house and saw the same car parked down the road the next evening, her heart raced. That was the moment she realized, David wasn't just a teacher. He wasn't just someone who admired her intellect. He was watching her. And he had crossed a line. She didn't know what to do. The fear gripped her chest, making it hard to breathe. She wanted to tell her parents, but what would they say? How could she explain that her teacher had become fixated on her? They would think she was overreacting. Her father, Michael, was always so busy with his hardware store, and her mother, Rebecca, was still recovering from the emotional scars of her own failed marriage. Sophia felt alone, trapped in a situation she didn't know how to escape. As the days passed, the tension grew. David's presence loomed over her, no matter where she went. She felt like she was constantly looking over her shoulder, always expecting to see him. At school, he would find ways to engage with her, always drawing her into conversations that she couldn't avoid. And the more he did it, the more his obsession grew. Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that he was always just one step behind her, waiting for her to slip up, to give him a sign that she felt the same way. One afternoon, after class, David did something that made Sophia's blood run cold. As she walked past his desk, he reached out and gently touched her hand. The contact was brief, but it sent a shockwave of fear through her. It was a touch that should have been innocent, except it wasn't. It felt like an invasion, like a claim, a gesture that crossed a line Sophia couldn't ignore. She quickly pulled her hand away, her heart pounding in her chest. "Thank you for the class," she mumbled, hurrying out of the room before he could say anything more. But the damage was done. She knew. This wasn't just a teacher-student relationship anymore. This was something darker, something that was impossible to ignore. Later that night, as Sophia lay in bed, her mind raced. She couldn't shake the image of David's eyes, the way they lingered on her, the way he seemed to be watching her every move. She could feel the weight of his gaze even when he wasn't around. And no matter how much she tried to rationalize it, she knew deep down that David wasn't going to stop. The next day, Sophia tried to act normal. She kept her distance from David, sitting in the back of the class, avoiding eye contact. But it didn't matter. He was always there, watching. Always waiting for the right moment to make his move. It was only a matter of time before things spiraled out of control. And Sophia had no idea just how far David would go to make her his. Sophia Mitchell was a senior at Riverton High School, a small town in Ohio, and she had always been a quiet achiever. She loved to read, to write, and to spend time lost in the pages of her favorite novels. But there was always something missing. Despite the smiles of her friends, despite the praise of her teachers, there was a loneliness she couldn't shake. She was raised by her father, Michael Mitchell, a hardworking man who owned the local hardware store, and her mother, Rebecca, who was always emotionally distant after a difficult divorce. Sophia had always found solace in books, but now, there was something different about her life, something unsettling. It started slowly, at first. Just a comment here, a question there, as David Turner, the substitute teacher, began to pay more attention to her. He'd ask about her essays, or sometimes linger after class, offering to help with her projects. At first, Sophia didn't think much of it. Teachers were supposed to care about their students' success, right? But something in David's gaze began to make her feel uneasy. There was a depth there, a level of interest that went beyond what was appropriate for a teacher. His presence became more noticeable, and she found herself looking over her shoulder, almost instinctively, when she walked down the school hallways. David, meanwhile, felt a growing connection with Sophia. He'd been a teacher for years, but never had a student intrigued him so much. It wasn't just her intelligence, it was the way she saw the world, the way she spoke about her dreams and her favorite stories. She was different from everyone else. There was a calmness to her, a quiet strength that David admired. In his mind, their conversations were something deeper. They had a bond. He convinced himself that she understood him in a way no one else did. He began to believe that they were meant to be. As the weeks passed, David's attention to Sophia became more focused. It started with small things. He would always find a reason to sit near her in class or comment on her writing during lunch. But soon, it wasn't enough. David started arriving early to school, before anyone else, just so he could watch Sophia walk into the building. He'd take the same route to class, just to be closer to her, to see her in the hallway. He made sure to praise her more than the other students, encouraging her to stay after class to discuss literature in more detail. At first, Sophia didn't mind. She appreciated the attention. She had always been praised for her intelligence, but now it felt different. The compliments felt warmer, more personal. Sometimes, after class, David would offer her advice on her writing. He would tell her that she had a special talent, that one day she could be a famous writer. It made her feel good, even if a small part of her felt uncomfortable with how closely David seemed to be watching her. One afternoon, after a particularly long class discussing Edgar Allan Poe's symbolism, Sophia stayed behind, as she often did, to ask David about one of her assignments. The conversation was flowing, and for a moment, she forgot about the tension that had started to creep in. But then, David said something that made her heart skip a beat. "Sophia," he said softly, "you're different from the others. You see things most people don't." Sophia froze. His voice had dropped in tone, and she could feel his eyes on her in a way that made her uncomfortable. He wasn't just talking about her writing anymore. There was something else there, something unspoken, lingering in the air between them. "Oh, thanks, Mr. Turner," Sophia replied, trying to sound casual as she gathered her things. David smiled, a smile that seemed to linger a bit too long. "You're welcome. You're very special, Sophia. You'll go far." The way he said it, the way his words hung in the air, felt wrong. It was more than just praise, it was a subtle claim. The compliment didn't feel like a simple acknowledgement of her abilities anymore. It felt like he was staking a claim over her, like he was trying to convince her that she belonged to him in some way. She quickly left the classroom, her mind racing. What was that? What had he meant by it? The next few days were even worse. David seemed to be everywhere she went. He found excuses to talk to her in the hallway, at lunch, after class. He was no longer just offering casual advice about her studies. He was commenting on her appearance, telling her how beautiful her smile was or how he loved the way her eyes lit up when she talked about books. His words became more personal, more intimate. Sophia tried to avoid him, but it felt impossible. She started to stay in the library after school, hoping to be left alone, but David would show up there, too, pretending to browse through books just to be near her. When she went to the local cafe to unwind, he would show up, ordering a coffee and sitting at the table next to hers. It was during one of these visits to the cafe that it happened. Sophia was reading her journal, lost in her own thoughts, when she saw David out of the corner of her eye. He was standing near the counter, but his gaze was fixed on her. She tried to ignore him, focusing on the pages of her journal, but she could feel his eyes on her, watching her every move. It was as if he was waiting for her to look up. When she finally did, their eyes met. The smile he gave her wasn't warm or friendly, it was intense, almost predatory. Sophia's stomach churned. Without thinking, she grabbed her things, muttering an excuse to the barista, and rushed out of the cafe. Her heart was pounding in her chest. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew one thing for sure: David was no longer just a teacher. He had become something darker. And Sophia was terrified. Back at school, she tried to act normal. She went through the motions of her day, attending class, completing assignments, but every time David walked into the room, her stomach twisted with dread. She tried to avoid him, but his presence seemed to follow her everywhere. She couldn't escape him. No matter how hard she tried, David was always there. His gaze was everywhere, even when he wasn't physically near her. It felt like he was watching her every moment of every day. And then, one day, after a particularly tense class, he said it, something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. "Sophia, you're more than just a student to me," he said, his voice low and steady. "You're the one I've been waiting for." Sophia froze, unable to speak. The room seemed to shrink around her. His words sent a chill down her spine. She wanted to scream, to run away, but all she could do was nod, barely able to breathe. This wasn't just a teacher offering advice anymore. This was something much darker, something far more dangerous. Sophia knew then that the line had been crossed. David Turner was no longer just a teacher in her life. He had become a danger. And no matter how much she tried to escape, she couldn't outrun the darkness that he had brought into her world. As the days turned into weeks, Sophia Mitchell couldn't escape the feeling that something was horribly wrong. Her mind, constantly clouded by David Turner's presence, couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that he was always watching. It wasn't just in the classroom anymore. It was everywhere. David was at the library, at the local cafe, and even near her home, lurking in places he had no business being. What had once seemed like an innocent admiration from a teacher had now become something far more dangerous. Sophia tried everything she could to avoid him. She sat in the back of the class, always keeping her head down, hoping he wouldn't notice her. She took different routes between classes, hoping to escape his prying eyes. But David was relentless. Every time she thought she was safe, he would find a way to get closer, to make her feel like there was no place she could go where she wouldn't be reminded of him. One chilly Tuesday afternoon, after class, as Sophia quickly packed her things and prepared to leave, she felt that familiar weight on the back of her neck. David's voice, soft but direct, broke through the hum of the classroom. "Sophia, can we talk for a moment?" She froze. Her heart skipped a beat, but she forced herself to keep her cool. She nodded, not trusting her voice to speak. She quickly walked to his desk, her breath shallow. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice a little too soothing, too calm. She could see the way his eyes lingered on her. It was like he was studying her every move, her every expression. She could feel the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Sophia tried to give a polite smile, but it felt forced. "Everything's fine, Mr. Turner. Just, schoolwork." David's gaze softened, but there was an intensity in his eyes that sent a shiver down her spine. He said, his voice dipping lower, "you really are something special. I wanted you to know that." Sophia's heart pounded in her chest. She took a step back, feeling a growing sense of panic. There it was again, that uncomfortable feeling that he wasn't just a teacher anymore. He was crossing a line, one that was so obvious now that she couldn't pretend it didn't exist. I should go," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. David didn't stop her. But his gaze didn't leave her as she hurried out of the room, her mind racing. That was the moment. She could no longer deny it, David Turner was obsessed with her. That evening, as Sophia walked home from school, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The same car she had seen parked outside her house multiple times was now parked further down the street. Her steps faltered. She had hoped it was just a coincidence. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. Her pace quickened. She had to get home. She had to get away from the unsettling thought that David was watching her every move. She reached her front door, feeling like she could finally breathe, until she saw it. The reflection of headlights in the window. She froze. The car was still there. David's car. Her stomach dropped. Sophia stepped into her house, quickly locking the door behind her, her heart racing. She rushed upstairs to her room and threw the curtains open, hoping to catch a glimpse of who it was. But the street was empty. The car was gone. Had she imagined it? No. She knew what she had seen. From that moment on, every day felt like a constant game of cat and mouse. David's presence in her life grew more and more invasive, and she began to lose the sense of control she once had. Every time she walked down the halls at school, she would see him standing at the edge of the hallway, watching her. Every time she visited the library, she would find him at a table, his eyes fixed on her. But David wasn't just watching her from afar anymore. One afternoon, as Sophia stayed behind after class to finish some homework, David did something that made her blood freeze. As she packed up her books, trying to focus on her work, she felt a hand gently rest on her shoulder. The touch was brief, but it was enough. She stiffened, her breath catching in her throat. She turned slowly, her stomach twisted with fear. David's face was inches from hers, his breath warm against her skin. "You're so talented, Sophia," he whispered, his voice now tinged with something darker, something unsettling. "You don't even know how special you are." Sophia could feel the air in her lungs leave her, her pulse pounding in her ears. This was it. She had to get out of there. She quickly jerked away from him, her heart racing. I have to go," she said, her voice trembling. David didn't try to stop her. But his eyes didn't leave her as she hurried out the door. Sophia had reached her breaking point. She couldn't do this anymore. The fear, the uncertainty, it was suffocating her. She had tried to tell herself that maybe it was all in her head, but there was no denying it anymore. David Turner was obsessed with her. The next day, when she got home, she sat her parents down. She had to tell them. But when she opened her mouth, the words wouldn't come. They didn't know what she was going through. They wouldn't understand. "I don't want to make a big deal out of it," she said quietly, trying to convince herself as much as her parents. "It's probably nothing." But deep down, she knew it wasn't nothing. She knew that David Turner was going to stop at nothing to make her his. And now, she had no idea how to escape. The tension in Sophia's life was at its breaking point. David's obsession had gone beyond the classroom, beyond casual conversation. His presence, once subtle and seemingly innocent, had grown into a constant, suffocating force in her life. The creeping dread she had felt from the very beginning had now turned into a full-blown nightmare. As the days wore on, Sophia realized that there was no escape from David's watchful eyes. She had tried to hide. She had tried to fight it. But the truth was clear, he wouldn't let her go. And now, she had to face the most terrifying truth of all: the only way to get away from David was to confront him. But how? And at what cost? The stakes had never been higher. What would she do next? Sophia Mitchell's life had become a constant state of fear. The person she once trusted, the teacher who had shown a keen interest in her academic potential, had turned into a nightmare she couldn't escape. David Turner's obsession had now fully taken over her world, and every time she thought she was out of reach, he found a way to pull her back in. The horrifying truth was undeniable now: David wasn't just a teacher anymore. He was a threat. It all started innocently enough, with casual conversations after class and his subtle admiration for her talent. But as weeks passed, his behavior escalated. It wasn't enough for David to observe her from afar anymore. He wanted more. He needed to be near her, to be part of her life in ways that made her skin crawl. And the worst part? Sophia didn't know how to stop him. David would show up at the library where she volunteered, sitting at a table just far enough away for her to see him but too close for comfort. He lingered in the halls, walking past her locker when he had no reason to be there. But what really began to terrify her was how he started to show up outside her home. One evening, as Sophia was heading out for a walk to clear her mind, she turned the corner to see a familiar car parked down the street. It was David's car. Her breath caught in her throat. She tried to brush it off, telling herself it was a coincidence. But then she saw it again the next day. And the day after that. Each time, the panic in her chest grew heavier. She knew. She had no doubt anymore. He was following her. And he had crossed a line that could no longer be ignored. Sophia tried her best to keep her distance, but David was always there, his presence looming like a dark cloud. The simple, innocent conversations after class had now turned into something much more sinister. The way he spoke to her, the way his eyes lingered on her when they spoke, it was more than just a teacher's interest. It felt like he was claiming her, marking her as his own. It was a Friday afternoon when everything came to a head. After a long week, Sophia stayed after class to finish some assignments, hoping for a bit of peace. As the last student left, she packed her bag quickly, eager to head home. But just as she stood to leave, she heard David's voice from behind her. "Sophia, I think you're leaving a little early." She turned around, forcing a smile, trying to hide the fear that was threatening to spill out. "I just need to get some work done at home." David was standing far too close to her desk, his eyes intense, but his smile was calm, almost too calm. "You've been working so hard lately. I thought maybe we could talk about your future plans. I think you have so much potential." Sophia felt the familiar wave of discomfort wash over her, but she tried to brush it off, thinking of ways to excuse herself quickly. "Thanks, but I really have to go." As she walked past him, she felt his hand brush against her arm. It wasn't an accident. It was intentional, and it felt like a violation. Sophia froze, her breath catching in her chest as the shock of his touch registered. Before she could even pull away, David spoke again, his voice low and almost soothing. "You don't have to rush, Sophia. You're special, you know. I see so much potential in you, and I just want to make sure you don't miss out on anything." The words hit her like a punch to the stomach. This wasn't just about helping her with school anymore. He was crossing into dangerous territory, pushing her boundaries in a way that made her skin crawl. Sophia's eyes widened with fear, and she hurriedly grabbed her bag, all but running out the door. But David's eyes followed her, unblinking, his gaze piercing her as she left the classroom. The moment she stepped into the hallway, the familiar sense of dread crept in. He was watching her. It wasn't until later that night that Sophia realized just how much danger she was in. She couldn't stop thinking about his words, his touch. She couldn't stop the image of him watching her in the hallway, standing just outside her door when she didn't know it. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. It was a message from David. "Hope you're doing okay. I just want you to know I'm always here for you. You're going to go far." Her heart stopped. A cold chill ran down her spine. How did he get her phone number? She hadn't given it to him, and yet there it was. Another line crossed. Sophia immediately blocked him, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. The walls around her seemed to close in. No one could understand what she was going through. She couldn't tell her parents. She didn't want them to worry. She couldn't tell her friends, because who would believe her? She was alone in this, and David had already started to make his presence known in ways that she could no longer ignore. The next morning, as she walked to school, Sophia noticed something different. It wasn't just the familiar tension in her chest. It was the sudden realization that he wasn't going to stop. David was out there, somewhere, watching. Waiting for the perfect moment to push even further. Sophia couldn't breathe. The world around her was closing in. How could she stop him? How could she get away from someone who had already infiltrated every part of her life? That afternoon, as she sat in the classroom, she noticed David standing in the doorway, watching her with an unsettling calmness. His presence felt suffocating. The air seemed to thicken with every passing second, and Sophia's heart raced. The once friendly teacher had now become a predator, and Sophia was the prey. Her thoughts were racing. She couldn't stay silent anymore. She had to act. But the question remained, how? How could she escape from someone who had already become a shadow in her life? Sophia Mitchell's life had spiraled into a terrifying mess, one she could no longer escape. The feeling of being watched, followed, and controlled by David Turner had reached its peak. Every day felt like a battle to keep her composure, to act normal, to pretend she wasn't living in a constant state of fear. But as David's behavior became more intrusive, more dangerous, Sophia realized she couldn't hide anymore. She had to confront the nightmare, no matter the cost. It started with small actions, David showing up at the library where she volunteered, waiting in the hallway when he had no reason to be there. But by now, he was in her thoughts constantly, following her on social media, sending her strange, overly personal messages. Each time, she tried to block him, but the messages kept coming, the presence too overwhelming. She felt trapped, cornered by a man who had invaded every part of her life. One cold November evening, after a long day of trying to dodge David's watchful eyes, Sophia decided she would finally confront him. She had to, for her own sanity. She couldn't live like this anymore, in fear, in hiding. She had to take a stand. The only problem was, she didn't know if she was strong enough to face him. Sophia stayed late after class that day, hoping to avoid the crowded halls and the weight of David's gaze. She gathered her books slowly, keeping her head down, moving as quietly as she could. Just as she was about to leave, she turned and saw him, David, standing in the doorway of the classroom, his posture casual but his eyes intense. He had been waiting for her, just like always. She froze for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. The fear was almost suffocating. But this time, something was different. This time, she wasn't going to run. She took a deep breath and walked toward him, trying to steady her nerves. David's smile was calm, but there was an unsettling edge to it. "Sophia," he said softly, his voice almost too sweet. "I thought we could talk. You've been so distant lately." The air between them was thick, heavy with tension. She could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. There was no room for politeness anymore. David had crossed too many lines, and she couldn't pretend it was anything else. "I don't want to talk to you, David," Sophia said, her voice shaking but firm. She felt a rush of adrenaline, the power of speaking her truth. "I'm scared of you. You're making me uncomfortable. You need to stop following me. Stop showing up everywhere I go." David's expression didn't change. If anything, his smile widened. "You think I'm following you?" He chuckled softly, but it didn't sound amused. It sounded like a warning. "Sophia, I'm just trying to help you. I see the potential in you. You're special. You'll understand one day. We're meant to be." His words sent a cold chill down her spine. The way he spoke, the way he looked at her, it wasn't the language of a teacher anymore. It was the language of a predator. And she was the prey. Sophia took a step back, her instinct screaming at her to run. But David stepped forward, closing the gap between them. She could feel the warmth of his body, the oppressive weight of his presence. He reached out, his hand brushing her arm in an almost casual way, as if they had known each other for years. "Don't touch me," she spat, pulling away from him. David's eyes narrowed, his calm demeanor faltering for just a moment. "Sophia," he said, his voice low now, almost a growl. "You're making this difficult. I just want what's best for you." His words sent a jolt of fear through her. She turned and ran, not stopping until she was out of the building. Her heart hammered in her chest as she breathed in the cold night air. She had confronted him. She had told him to stop. But it felt like nothing had changed. If anything, it had gotten worse. He wasn't going to let her go. Not now. The next few days were a blur of constant vigilance, of looking over her shoulder, of avoiding eye contact with anyone who might give David another chance to slip back into her life. Her phone buzzed with more strange messages from him, long, rambling texts that made no sense, yet sent a chill through her every time she read them. "You're the one I need, Sophia. We're meant to be together. I know you feel it too." The last message she received that week was the final straw. "I know where you live, Sophia. I've been watching you. I won't stop. You belong with me." Sophia stared at the screen in horror. The words were so casual, so possessive, that they felt like they were suffocating her. He knew where she lived. He had been watching her, following her for weeks, months. The line had been crossed. She couldn't wait anymore. She couldn't wait for him to hurt her, for him to make the next move. She needed to act now. Sophia told her parents that night. She had to. They needed to know. She couldn't keep living in fear, hiding from someone who had become a constant presence in her life. As she sat down with her mother and father, she felt a lump rise in her throat. The words wouldn't come. How could she explain to them that the man they trusted was the one who had been stalking her? How could she make them understand the danger she was in? But when she finally spoke, the tears came pouring out. David Turner, he's been following me. He's been sending me messages, showing up everywhere I go. I don't know what to do. I'm scared, Mom. Dad, I'm scared. Her parents listened, their faces full of shock and concern. They didn't hesitate. They immediately called the police. Sophia felt a wave of relief wash over her, but there was still a gnawing feeling in her stomach. What if it wasn't enough? What if David didn't stop? What if he came for her again? The police took immediate action, launching an investigation into David Turner's behavior. As the days passed, Sophia stayed at home, avoiding any place he might show up. She felt trapped, but at least now she knew that she wasn't alone. Her parents had her back. The police were involved. And David? He was about to learn that his obsession would no longer be tolerated. Sophia Mitchell stood at the edge of her life, her heart racing, her thoughts scattered. The events that had led her here felt like a nightmare, one that she couldn't wake up from, no matter how hard she tried. Everything she had known, her sense of safety, her future, her peace of mind, had been ripped away by the one person she should have been able to trust, David Turner. It had been weeks since she told her parents. The police had been involved. They had investigated David's past, uncovered his pattern of manipulative behavior, and put a restraining order in place. Yet, the sense of unease never truly left her. Every time she stepped out of her house, every time her phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number, her heart would skip. The fear was relentless, gnawing at her from the inside out. It wasn't just the physical threat David posed, it was the emotional toll. The way he had crept into her life, undermining her sense of security, making her doubt herself. The constant barrage of messages, the relentless watching, the manipulation, it had broken something inside her. She had become a prisoner of her own fear. But now, for the first time, she felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't alone anymore. Her parents, the police, they were standing with her. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to take her life back. Sophia sat in her room that evening, staring at the phone in her hands. She had blocked David's number countless times, but his messages always found a way through. That last one, the one that said, "I know where you live. I'll never stop watching you. You belong with me," it had shattered any illusion of normalcy she had left. Her fingers hovered over the screen, her mind torn between terror and determination. She had to confront this. She had to stop letting him have control over her life. It was time to stand up to him, to take back the power he had stolen. Sophia stood up, gripping the phone tightly, her heart pounding. It was late, and she could hear the soft hum of the house around her. Her parents were asleep, unaware of the battle she was fighting within her own mind. She walked to the window, looking out into the darkness, but all she could see was the reflection of the girl she used to be, the one who once had dreams of becoming a writer, who once believed that nothing could take away her freedom. She knew what she had to do. The next morning, Sophia made the call. Her voice was steady, but inside, she was shaking. She dialed the number she had been avoiding for weeks. The number of the officer who had been assigned to her case. She was done hiding. "I'm ready," she said, her voice unwavering. "It's time to end this." The moment she walked into the police station that afternoon, something changed within her. The fear that had paralyzed her for so long was still there, but there was a new strength now, a quiet resolve that hadn't been there before. She wasn't going to let David Turner control her any longer. The police had set up a meeting with David. They had been tracking him, keeping tabs on his whereabouts, waiting for him to slip up. But when the time came, Sophia knew she had to be the one to face him. It wasn't just about putting an end to his obsession. It was about taking back her life, her dignity, her peace. As she entered the interrogation room, David was already sitting there, his back to the door. The room was cold, the air heavy with tension. He turned slowly when she walked in, and for the first time in what felt like forever, their eyes met. His face was a mask of calm, as if he hadn't done anything wrong, as if he hadn't spent months watching her, tormenting her, trying to control her life. He smiled that same smile he always gave her, the one that used to make her feel safe, but now it only made her stomach churn. "Sophia," he said softly, "I knew you'd come. I knew you would realize we're meant to be together." But this time, Sophia wasn't afraid. The fear that had kept her locked in place for so long had finally started to dissolve, replaced by something far more powerful. Anger. Defiance. She had had enough. "No," she said, her voice firm. "We're not meant to be together. You're sick. You've been watching me, following me, controlling me. And I'm done. You will never hurt me again." David's smile faltered for the first time. His calm facade cracked, revealing something darker. He stood up, but the officers in the room immediately moved to restrain him. He was still trying to control the situation, to manipulate her into believing that what he had done was somehow for her own good. But Sophia was no longer that scared girl. She was a survivor. The officers quickly cuffed David, and he was led out of the room, still protesting, still insisting that he had done nothing wrong. As he was taken away, Sophia felt a weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time in months, she could breathe again. She wasn't just free from him physically. She was free from the fear, the torment, the control. Sophia left the police station that day with a new sense of purpose. She had taken back her life. She had faced her worst fear and won. But as she walked out into the daylight, she couldn't help but wonder, what kind of world was it where someone like David could go so far? Where does the line between admiration and obsession blur? And how many others out there are quietly suffering, too afraid to speak out? Sophia had been lucky. She had the support of her family, the police, and the courage to stand up for herself. But what about those who didn't have that? What about those who were still too afraid to tell someone they were being watched, manipulated, controlled? The truth was, the real battle wasn't over for Sophia. It had only just begun. Because her story, her strength, could be the light for someone else who was still trapped in the dark. And she was determined to make sure that no one would have to fight this battle alone again. What do you think about Sophia's decision to confront David and end the nightmare? How do you feel about her strength and determination? Have you ever been in a situation where you had to fight your fears head-on? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone else who needs to hear it. Don't forget to share this video and help others find the courage to stand up for themselves.